Dad sabotaged my wedding because he didn't like my partner. Claimed you'll thank me one day. I cut him off completely and married my partner in secret. He found out and had a breakdown. My father, Claiborne, isn't just a man. He's an institution. In our small town near Mobile, Alabama, his name is practically legendary. He built his empire from the ground up, a lumber company that he expanded over the years until he owned half the local business scene. People either feared or revered him. And he always made sure it was in that order. He wasn't a bad man, just a controlling one. Claiborne's philosophy was simple: as long as everyone did exactly what he wanted, life went smoothly. Step out of line, and things got messy. Unfortunately, I'd spent my entire life stepping just outside his lines. My name is Marlena, and I'm his only daughter. When I was younger, I was Daddy's little girl. I learned quickly that being adored by Claiborne meant molding myself to fit his vision. But that adoration soured the minute I started thinking for myself. I could see it in his eyes whenever I'd speak up or push back. He hated losing control, especially over me. He had big plans, you see. Plans that required me to marry a particular kind of man, preferably one with a similar vision for life, as he put it. But of course, life doesn't work that way. And, to Claiborne's horror, I fell in love with someone who couldn't be further from his ideals. Luca was everything Claiborne despised. Quiet, thoughtful, a little rough around the edges, but a dreamer. He'd come to Mobile to open a small coffee shop, just one, a quaint little place on Main Street, with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. It was everything Claiborne's life was not: modest, warm, and real. And Luca, with his gentle southern drawl and faded thrift store sweaters, was the best part of it. I met him during a thunderstorm, when I ducked into his shop to wait it out. We ended up talking until closing time. I knew right then he was different. And I knew my father wouldn't approve. I kept Luca a secret for a long time, dreading the inevitable clash. But the day came when I couldn't hide him anymore. One evening, as I braced myself to introduce Luca to Claiborne, my hands were clammy with nerves. I could feel Luca's fingers tighten around mine as we stood in the driveway. I could tell he was anxious too, but he was doing his best to keep his cool. "Whatever happens," he whispered, leaning close, "I'm here with you. Don't let him get into your head." I nodded, wishing I shared his calm. The door swung open before we even reached it, and there stood Claiborne, scrutinizing us with narrowed eyes. "So, this is him, huh?" Claiborne's voice was low and unimpressed. "Yes, Dad," I replied, my voice steadying. "This is Luca. He's the man I love." There was a tense silence as Claiborne's eyes flicked over Luca, his face an unreadable mask. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Eldridge," Luca said, extending a hand. I could tell he was trying to keep things polite, but his voice had an edge, like he knew what was coming. Claiborne looked at the hand for a beat too long, then finally took it in a brief, dismissive shake. "Love, huh?" he drawled, leaning back. "Interesting choice of words, Marlena." I felt Luca stiffen beside me. He glanced at me, and I could see him silently asking, "Should I say something? Should I leave?" We sat down in the formal living room, Claiborne's arena. The walls were lined with books he never read and portraits of him in various power poses. It was a shrine to his success, and a warning to anyone who dared step out of line. "So, Luca, I hear you run. What is it? A coffee shop?" Claiborne said, with a half smirk, like it was some kind of joke. "Yes, sir," Luca replied, his voice firm. "I own Magnolia Coffee on Main. It's been a dream of mine for years." "Dreams," Claiborne sneered, sipping his scotch. "Interesting. Do you think dreams pay the bills, Luca? Do they provide for a family?" Luca held his ground, meeting Claiborne's gaze without flinching. "I believe that if you're doing something you love, you find a way to make it work. Magnolia Coffee has been growing steadily since I opened it." Claiborne snorted, clearly unimpressed. "My daughter deserves someone who can give her stability, Luca. Someone who can build a future. A man with ambition." "Ambition isn't about the size of your bank account," Luca said quietly, his jaw tightening. "It's about the impact you make, how you treat the people around you." I felt pride swell in my chest. Luca didn't just talk big, he lived those words every day. But Claiborne couldn't see it. Or maybe he just refused to. "I think we're done here," Claiborne said, standing abruptly, signaling that Luca had been dismissed. "Marlena, we'll talk later." That night was the first of many fights with my father. As soon as Luca left, he laid into me, his voice sharp and angry. "You can't be serious about him, Marlena," he said, pacing. "That man has nothing to offer you." "I love him," I replied, refusing to back down. "And he makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" "You're throwing your life away for a man with a coffee shop," he barked, his face flushed. "Think about your future. About our family name." "Dad, I'm not your project," I snapped, my voice rising. "This is my life, not yours." His face contorted with anger, and for a second, I thought he might actually yell. But he just stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "One day, you'll see I was right." After that night, I tried to keep Luca out of family affairs as much as possible. We got engaged, but I didn't tell my parents immediately. I wanted it to be our moment, without Claiborne's cloud hanging over us. When I did break the news, predictably, he was furious. "That man is using you, Marlena. Don't you see it?" he shouted, his face red. "Using me for what, Dad? He's not after my money, or my last name, or anything. He just loves me." Claiborne scoffed. "Love? Love doesn't pay the bills, Marlena. It doesn't get you anywhere in life. Love fades, but success? Success lasts. Maybe your version of success does. But I don't want that. I just want to be happy." He glared at me, his hands clenched into fists. "You're going to regret this, Marlena. You'll thank me one day." Those words haunted me. As Luca and I planned our wedding, I tried to ignore the nagging fear that Claiborne would do something drastic. And then, things started falling apart. First, our venue called, claiming they were double booked. When I pushed back, the manager got nervous and stammered that they were under orders. Then the florist canceled, mumbling about complications. Even the caterer pulled out, and it wasn't hard to guess who was behind it. Claiborne was sabotaging my wedding. I confronted him at his office. He sat behind his massive oak desk, looking calm and self-satisfied, like he hadn't just destroyed months of planning. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life." He just looked at me, a smug smile tugging at his lips. "You're making a mistake, Marlena. I'm saving you from it." "By ruining my wedding?" I shouted, feeling tears sting my eyes. "How can you be so cruel?" His face hardened. "One day, you'll thank me," he repeated, his voice cold. "I'd rather see you heartbroken now than trapped in a marriage to that nobody." I stared at him, my heart breaking. "You're not saving me from anything, Dad. You're just proving that you care more about control than my happiness." With that, I stormed out, leaving him to stew in his self-righteousness. That night, I told Luca everything. He held me while I cried, whispering soothing words and promising me that we'd find a way. So, we did. We eloped in secret, just the two of us and Karina, my best friend, who officiated. Under the quiet Tennessee sky, I married the love of my life, away from my father's influence. It was intimate, real, and pure. For the first time, I felt free. Weeks passed, and I cut off all contact with my father. My mother called, pleading for me to come home, saying Claiborne was falling apart. But I couldn't. The hurt was too raw, too deep. I missed her, missed the family dinners and the warmth, but I couldn't go back, not yet. Then, one evening, as Luca and I sat on the porch, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. "It's Dad. Please, Marlena, he's not well. He's asking for you." I looked at Luca, torn. I knew seeing my father would reopen old wounds, but part of me felt the pull. It wasn't that simple, though. I stared at the text for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Claiborne wasn't someone who just wasn't well. For him to ask for me, he must have truly spiraled. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave him to deal with the mess he'd made. But another part, the part that remembered the man he used to be before control poisoned him, felt compelled to go. "I think I need to go see him," I told Luca quietly. He nodded, understanding, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, holding my hand. I need to see for myself," I replied, squeezing his fingers. "And if I don't, he'll keep holding this over me, even if he's never said sorry in his life." The next morning, Luca drove me to my parents' house. My stomach twisted with nerves as I walked up to the door, Luca's reassuring presence at my side. My mother opened the door, her face drawn and tired. She hugged me tight, whispering, "Thank you for coming." She led us to the den, where Claiborne sat slumped in his recliner, a shadow of the man I remembered. He looked older, grayer, his eyes dull and lifeless. When he saw me, something flickered in his gaze, a mix of anger, desperation, and maybe even regret. "Marlena," he croaked, his voice rough. "You're here." I nodded, feeling a strange numbness as I took in the sight of him. This was the man who had once controlled every part of my life, the man who tried to ruin my happiness because he couldn't bear to lose control. And now, he looked defeated. "Dad," I said simply, sitting across from him. Luca stood beside me, his silent support giving me strength. "Why did you ask me to come?" He looked away, staring at the wall. "You've always been stubborn," he muttered. "Just like your mother. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I snapped, my voice rising. "From love? From happiness? Or from living a life you couldn't control?" He winced, but I didn't care. I needed to say this, to finally let him see the pain he'd caused. You didn't ruin my wedding, Dad. Luca and I got married, and it was beautiful. And you missed it. Because you couldn't stand the idea of me making my own choice. He was silent for a long time, his hands clenching and unclenching. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd thank me. One day. Well, I don't, I said, my voice steady. And I never will. He looked down, his face pale. For the first time, I saw something that looked like regret. But it didn't make up for what he'd done, and it certainly didn't change my decision. I stood up, holding Luca's hand. I came here to tell you this face to face, Dad. You're no longer a part of my life. Not until you can truly understand what you've done. You've lost me, and it's your fault. As I turned to leave, I noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders sagged. He looked like a man who had finally realized the depth of his own mistakes. But it was too late. Luca and I walked out, leaving Claiborne in the silent house that had once been his kingdom. My mother watched us go, her face a mixture of sadness and relief. She knew, deep down, that my father had finally lost his grip, not only on me but on the power he had held over everyone. A few months later, I got word that Claiborne had sold the company. It was the one thing he'd spent his life building, his pride and joy. But without me, without a family to pass it down to, it meant nothing to him. The man who had once ruled over our lives was now just a shell, sitting alone in a big empty house. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd finally be free of him. Then, one day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a letter from my father. It was short, but it said everything I needed to hear. Marlena. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I understand now what I've lost, and I know it's my own doing. I know you don't owe me forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see it all now. I'll be here, always, if you ever want to come back. If not, I'll understand. Dad. I read it, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt a pang of sadness, of nostalgia for the father I'd once looked up to. But the other part, the part that had found happiness with Luca, the part that had fought so hard for my own life, felt a sense of satisfaction. He'd finally realized that he couldn't control me, couldn't dictate my choices. And as I looked at the life I'd built, free from his shadow, I knew I had no regrets.